Hulk Hogan is one of the greatest and most influential wrestlers of all time. He's also one of the most recognizable pop culture figures of the last 50 years. At one point, he had an adoring audience in the millions, but in recent years, wrestling fans have slowly turned on him. Some of the blame can be placed on the numerous scandals that have taken a toll on his reputation. His backstage politicking and refusal to put other wrestlers over has also negatively affected the way he's now perceived by fans. That said, an element that cannot be ignored is Hogan's unparalleled ability to bend the truth. Despite working in an industry filled with storytellers where the line between fact and fiction often blurs, Bollea stands out from the crowd as one of the greatest liars in pro wrestling history. The sheer breadth and depth of his dishonesty is titanic. Countless videos, articles, Reddit posts, and message board discussions have been devoted to this subject alone. Even this lengthy video will only be scratching the surface, but it's a topic so interesting that I felt the need to make a video about it. Because investigating just one lie often reveals layers and layers of even more lies that lead you down a rabbit hole so deep you begin to wonder why he would do any of this. A good place to start would be with one of Hogan's most well-known lies. That being the story of how he was supposed to be the original spokesperson for what would become the George Foreman Grill. It's a story that sounds very plausible when you first hear it. Maybe you've even heard this from someone in the past and believed it. The problem is, it appears that Hogan made it up. The Hulkster has told two entirely different versions of how he supposedly missed out on the George Foreman Grill. He claimed that he left his house early to get some McDonald's and beat all of the soccer moms when it came time to pick up his kids from school.
I went home, hit the answer machine, and it was Sam Perlmutter, the guy that handled a lot of stuff for me and George. He goes, "Hey, Hogan, I got two things. I got a grill and a blender for you, you know."
And when he called Sam back, George had already taken the grill.
George took the grill.
The $300 million
grill. And it made
grill.
$300 million.
Hogan was left with a mixer that would go on to be marketed as the, admittedly cool-sounding, Hulk Hogan Thunder Mixer. Despite the fact that this story doesn't make any sense and that's not how these deals work, many articles have reported Hogan's story to be true. But Hogan has told an entirely different version of the story that contradicts this one. In 2011, he claimed that his agent came to him with the offer to endorse a meatball maker or a grill. And Hogan was so enamored with the meatball maker idea that he told his agent to give the grill to one of his other clients, who would end up being George Foreman. Curiously, both of these entirely different stories also contradict the story told by the man who invented the George Foreman grill himself, Michael Bohn. According to Bohn, he sent a sample to someone he knew was working with George Foreman. Foreman was endorsing mufflers at the time, and Bohn wanted to know if he was interested in endorsing something else. However, Foreman wasn't sold on the grill, and he basically forgot about it for months until his wife got involved and he agreed to be the spokesperson for the Lean Mean grilling machine, earning hundreds of millions of dollars in the process.
So if you like your food lean, mean, and tasty, don't forget to pick up one on your way out.
From this side of the story, it seems pretty obvious that the makers of the grill were targeting Foreman specifically and were willing to wait months for him to agree. So neither of Hogan's stories really match up with what is arguably the most reliable narrative. For his part, Foreman hasn't said much on the topic other than saying that Hogan is one of his best friends. Either way, the Hulkster would end up getting his own grill, the Hulk Hogan Ultimate Grill.
Hey guys, I'm Hulk Hogan. Stay with me for the next half hour. I'm gonna show you my latest invention, Hulk Hogan's Ultimate Grill. Brother.
It would eventually be recalled due to being a fire hazard. The George Foreman grill story is a good place to start this video because it illustrates several themes common to Hogan's lies. At first, it doesn't seem far-fetched. It could almost be believable if Terry didn't choose to lie about something with an established origin story, and if he didn't tell multiple different versions of his story that undercut his credibility. You can see the same traits in Bollea's stories about his athletic past. On more than one occasion, he has told almost verbatim the same story about being scouted by the New York Yankees and Cincinnati Reds, before suffering an unfortunate elbow injury.
I ran up, I picked up the one arm and threw it underhanded at first base and broke that little cap on my elbow, so my arm was never the same.
Again, it sounds plausible. Lots of pro wrestlers have had athletic careers before cinching up a pair of wrestling boots and stepping into the ring. A notable example would be Randy Savage, who played for several seasons in the minor leagues. The idea that Hogan had a successful high school baseball career before suffering an injury isn't that hard to believe. But a believable lie is never enough to him, so he had to say wild shit like he had a .714 batting average when he competed in the Little League World Series. Who does this guy think he is, Joshua Fabia? The Hulkster probably assumed that there weren't any records to prove his story wrong, but the Little League World Series actually has a record of every kid who ever competed, and Terry Bollea is nowhere to be found. As you've probably started to grasp, a lot of Hogan's tall tales start with something plausible but become wilder and wilder until he ends up telling blatant lies and getting fact-checked. For another example, let's look at some of his stories from his days in the movie industry. Hogan has claimed that he rewrote the scripts for a number of movies he worked on. Most notably, he claimed in his 2002 autobiography that he and Vince McMahon completely rewrote the script for No Holds Barred, but didn't receive writing credits for it because they weren't in the Writers Guild. If you've ever seen the movie No Holds Barred, this actually seems believable, even more so when you read that the end fight scene, which involves a man getting electrocuted ass first, apparently came to Hogan in a dream while he fell asleep on the toilet. The stories become harder and harder to believe when he says things like Robert Evans, the head of Paramount, wanted to turn him into the next John Wayne. The problem here is that even at the earliest, Robert Evans would have been out as head of Paramount for at least a decade by the time this alleged meeting took place. Maybe Terry talked to a guy about a movie deal while eating at a Bob Evans and he got confused. It's not as ridiculous as Hogan's claim that he was offered the lead role of Randy the Ram in The Wrestler, but turned it down because he thought the movie was too good and he would ruin its credibility. Very humble, Hulk. Only the film's director, Darren Aronofsky, has directly said that this is not true, because of course it isn't. It's not even the first time he said he's turned down a role in a big Hollywood production. According to Hogan, there's an alternate reality where he played Connor McLeod in Highlander. And there was some very real script for a movie where he was supposed to play a cop with Pamela Anderson as his love interest and Brad Pitt as a partner who dies in the line of duty. I just want you to take a moment to picture how fucking awful that would be. Okay, as silly and hilarious as Hogan's lies can often be, they don't all paint him as a buffoonish storyteller who's caught up in his own imagination. Some of these lies have had a genuine impact on his reputation. Such was the case in the early 90s when his name was tied to a growing steroid scandal among professional wrestlers. In June of 1991, Dr. George Zahorian III was convicted on 8 counts of distributing steroids and 4 counts of illegally distributing painkillers. Zahorian was the ringside physician for the Pennsylvania Athletic Commission and, as was revealed during the trial, had been supplying professional wrestlers with the substances. Several wrestlers testified that they purchased steroids from Zahorian after it was made illegal to distribute them in 1988. Zahorian himself also admitted that he sold steroids to several wrestlers, including Hulk Hogan and the men who testified. Hogan, who was initially listed as John Doe to protect his identity, was supposed to testify, but was excused at the last minute. Despite avoiding the witness stand, Bollea was now linked with the steroid case. He attempted to clear his name by appearing on the Arsenio Hall show in what he would later refer to in his autobiography as his biggest mistake. In fairness to Hulk, I'm sure he thought this would be his biggest mistake back in 2002. Hogan's appearance on Arsenio Hall was extremely awkward and unconvincing. He opened up by admitting that he had a prior history with Zahorian.
I was one of the patients of this doctor, and then later on down the line, he got into all these other things, but
I'm no lawyer, but that seems like the kind of thing you would try to avoid saying at all costs. Aside from saying basically about 50 times in 10 minutes,
basically I'd being a sling. So basically I made the right decision. Well, basically I'd rather not comment on that, but
he trotted out many of the excuses used by fake natties that we are familiar with today. He claimed that he had always been big ever since he was a boy.
You were my size then.
I was 196 pounds when I was 10 years old. When I graduated from high school, I was 300 pounds, and right now I'm about 295.
He also said that he was offended by people speculating about his PED use because it took so much hard work to achieve his physique.
So basically, I was insulted, and basically I've trained 20 years, 2 hours a day to look like I do.
He wasn't a steroid user, and he didn't use steroids. But he did use them as prescribed by a doctor as part of a sports therapy program to recover from injuries, on 3 occasions.
And on 3 different occasions, I had the same type muscle injuries. That is the extent of Hulk Hogan's steroid use.
It was all bullshit, though. After this interview, Hogan would be publicly called out by fellow wrestlers superstar Billy Graham and David Schultz. Graham claimed that when he met Bollea in the mid-70s, Terry approached him and asked for advice on taking the substances. A story he reiterated 20 years later in an interview with the Hannibal TV.
How do I become a professional wrestler and how do I take steroids? Oh, he told me he'd been taking steroids for 1 full year at the time I met him.
Schultz went even further, saying he injected Bollea well over 100 times and that sometimes he took 12 cc's 3 times a week.
All you should do is come out and tell them the truth. Quit lying to them. Tell them the truth and be man enough to tell them the truth, and say, hey, I did steroids.
Eventually, the bad press associated with Hogan reached the point that he was placed on a leave of absence from the WWF in April of 1992. In spite of this fact, and Hogan ultimately leaving the WWF and later signing with their chief rival, WCW, Hogan's name would be tied to the scandal for several years.
Some people now claim that his hard-muscled good guy image really came from his past use of dangerous drugs.
In December of 1993, Vince McMahon was indicted on charges of distributing steroids due to cooperation from Dr. George Zahorian. This time, Hogan would actually testify, under immunity from prosecution, of course. Although Hogan admitted that PED use was fairly common in the Federation and that he used McMahon's secretary as a sort of go-between for Dr. Zahorian, he said that Vince never purchased PEDs for him or ordered him to take them. McMahon was ultimately acquitted of the distribution charges, but the reputation of the WWF and pro wrestling as a whole was tarnished by the steroid scandal. For his part, Hogan would reveal more and more about his PED use as time went by. In his first autobiography, he said that he probably started taking steroids in 1975, but at the time, every wrestler he knew took them, and they were being used by athletes in every sport. Quote, "Nobody said, 'Here, stick this in your ass or eat this pill, it'll kill you.' Nobody told us that if you took steroids for 30 years, it could be harmful to your long-term health. I never had a question about whether I would take them. It was part of my daily regimen. Did you take a shower today? Yeah. Did you brush your teeth? Yeah. Did you take your steroids today? Yeah. Okay, let's go. That was the deal. It was how I lived." End quote. On one hand, it is easy to empathize with Hulk Hogan on this issue. Almost every athlete is on something for reasons Hulk even went into in his book. The overwhelming majority of pro wrestlers at the time were on them, but Hogan was singled out because he was so famous and popular.
The paper speculated when my name got thrown in the ringer, it turned into the Hulk Hogan trial, and they didn't direct the focus on what this thing was all about.
On the other hand, it was Hogan's popularity that made it so galling when he went onto Arsenio Hall and told everyone that he was a goody-good boy whose body was the result of training, saying his prayers, and eating his vitamins.
And my theme is if you train, say your prayers, eat your vitamins, and believe in yourself, just like I have done, brother, you can have everything you want out of life, and I'm not ashamed of anything I've done.
And a teeny tiny bit of steroids. Only 3 times. Didn't you guys see how big he was when he was 10? That's all natural, brother. Hogan lying about his PED use was so unconscionable because, maybe more than any other wrestler, he was associated with kids. While the guy was sticking needles in his ass, his likeness was being used to sell children's vitamins.
Hulk Hogan Vitamins, the new champion of children's chewables.
I don't know if it's possible to come up with a more cynical juxtaposition than that to show the duplicitous nature of Hulkamania. As far as Hulkster lies go, it's still pretty far from being the worst. In the end, Hogan himself was the main casualty of these lies. The same cannot be said for some of his other deceits. Let's take a look at the infamous incident at Survivor Series 1991, where Hogan claimed that Mark Calloway, better known as The Undertaker, injured him. Even though Undertaker's side of the story wouldn't come out for 30 years, I think we should discuss it first, because he mentioned the events leading up to it as well. In The Undertaker's version of events, Hogan was already mentioning his neck backstage for hours before the fight.
So he's telling me, he goes, "Hey, I got this neck injury." He says, "I'm really nervous about taking your finish." And
to which Taker assured him that he would hold Hogan so tight that nothing could happen.
"I promise you, I will have you so tight that there's no way possible that you're going to hurt your neck."
When they eventually went for the tombstone spot in the match, Hogan claimed that Taker injured him.
As soon as my knees hit, I hear, "Oh, you got me, brother."
As Calloway recalls, he genuinely believed that he had hurt Hogan and was afraid that he had killed the Golden Goose, a fear that only got worse as Hulk apparently played up the injury in the aftermath.
And then I hear, "Somebody get my wife and kids on the phone."
The following Tuesday, Mark would get the chance to rewatch the match and notice that Hogan's head came nowhere near the chair. Subsequently, he confronted Hogan as respectfully as he could.
"Terry, I watched it back. Your head never hit."
Hogan's response was that when Taker went for the tombstone, he held Hulk so tightly that it jammed his neck, because he couldn't move.
That's what jammed my neck, because I couldn't move at all.
I think it's important to see the Undertaker's side of the story first, because he has no reason to be dishonest here. If anything, he's merely setting the record straight on a story that Hogan has told about him for several decades, with each retelling contradicting the others. In his 2002 autobiography, Belea said that Ric Flair slipped a chair into the ring and the Undertaker hit him with a pile driver on top of the chair. Quote, "He also screwed my neck up something fierce. It wasn't his fault. He took care of me and made sure my head didn't hit the mat. But the jolt of my neck being stretched like that sent me right to the hospital. I was in there for a couple of days. Everybody wanted to fuse the discs in my neck together, but I decided against it. It would be years before I got all of the feeling back in my arms. But 6 days later, I was wrestling The Undertaker again in a special pay-per-view rematch called Tuesday in Texas, because Ric Flair's interference had made the title null and void." End quote. During a 2006 episode of Hogan Knows Best, he would change this story and give what is the most insane version of events.
I feel like I got the neck brace on after The Undertaker spiked me on the concrete in Detroit in '74.
Whatever truth there may be to Hogan's story of potentially being injured during this match, he definitely wasn't spiked on the concrete by The Undertaker in 1974, because A, that didn't happen, and B, Mark Calloway was 9 years old in 1974. This version of events is so odd even for Hulk Hogan that I think he might have just had a stroke or something while he was saying it, because it makes no sense whatsoever. By the time 2009 rolled around and Hogan released his second book, My Life Outside the Ring, he dialed back the insanity, but this version of events still contradicted the one from his first book. In this retelling, Hogan said that Taker dropped his head on the metal chair in the nastiest tombstone of all tombstones. This was all apparently part of the plan, according to Hogan. What wasn't part of the plan was how sweaty Hogan was, and as a result, when Taker dropped the tombstone on him, his skull made contact with the chair, and the jolt of the whole move threw his neck out. I'm putting all of that in quotations, by the way. Hogan would go on to say that after eschewing doctor-advised surgery on his neck, he went to a chiropractor in Tampa. And after 6 months of hard work and deep tissue massage therapy, he was able to get back to some sense of normalcy. According to Hogan, the repercussions of that move have never gone away. The backs of his triceps were still a little numb, and he couldn't feel anything in the tips of his fingers, which made it difficult to tie his bandanas or button his shirts. This again directly contradicts what he said in his first book. Quote, "It would be years before I got all the feeling back in my arms." End quote. Over the next few years, Hogan would change and tweak this story while keeping the broad strokes of it the same. During a 2010 interview with Michael "The Voice" Schiavello, Hogan admitted that when he watched the tape of the match, he realized his head didn't hit the mat.
But I looked the tape back, and my head never hit.
However, he attributed the jerk of the move to his neck injury and claimed to not have any feeling in his shoulders, triceps, or hands.
I still don't have any feeling in my shoulders or my triceps, or my hands are numb.
Wow.
A little later, he claimed that the injury wasn't anyone's fault.
Because my head didn't hit. It wasn't like he dropped me or I slipped. It wasn't anything like that. It was just the jerk of my neck not being strong enough.
Funny how we've gone from, "Ow, you got me, brother," to "It wasn't like he dropped me or I slipped. It wasn't anything like that." The story does get even more interesting, though. Back in January of 2013, Hogan filed a $50 million medical malpractice lawsuit against the Laser Spine Institute, claiming that they persuaded him to undergo multiple ineffective spinal procedures that made his back problems worse. During the deposition for the case, Hogan, being under oath, gave what is presumably the most truthful version of the story. From his side at least. When he was directly questioned about his previous statements, calling the tombstone from The Undertaker the straw that slaughtered the camel's back, he said he didn't remember writing that. When asked if he said the tombstone was the nastiest tombstone of all tombstones that caused his neck, calves, shoulder, biceps, triceps, and forearms to go numb, Hogan said that wasn't completely accurate. Hogan was further asked if he had claimed that the repercussions for Undertaker's tombstone in 1991 had never gone away, and Hogan gave some strange story about how he regained feeling in his hands after burning them on a radiator, but also said that he had adapted to the numb fingers by learning to tie bandanas and button shirts differently.
He'll adapt.
Overall, this story is pretty weird. It's not out of the realm of possibility that Hogan did get his neck jammed or tweaked during the match with The Undertaker at Survivor Series, It doesn't take a lot of direct force to hurt your neck, and apparently he was hospitalized after the match for real. It's also quite possible that he has some numbness in his hands, but he has had many injuries and multiple spinal surgeries throughout his long career. The problem is that he has told so many conflicting versions of this story, some of them being so outlandishly wrong that you wonder how he came up with them in the first place. If The Undertaker is to be believed, and there is no reason to think he's lying about this, Hogan also changed his story when confronted with evidence, but still maintained that Taker had injured him, seemingly just so that Hogan could have something to hold over his head.
I was like, okay, I kind of realized, okay, I know what you're all about, and that's all I needed,
Then, years later, he reverted back to the story about being tombstoned onto a steel chair, even though he had long since known it never happened that way. This is a pretty abridged version of the story too. David Bixenspan wrote a lengthy post about this on Substack that I cribbed pretty heavily for the video. I would suggest checking the post out though, because he does go over the story in more detail. At the end of the day, it's sort of a boy who cried wolf situation. Hogan has lied about the story so much that there is no way to know when he's actually telling the truth. That is a pretty common thing with him that will become a running theme as we get deeper into this video. Time and time again, he is able to find the borderlands between fact and fiction. He can take a story with a grain of truth and weave it into a narrative that seems plausible enough at first glance. Although, upon closer inspection, it reveals a tangled web of exaggerations, if not outright lies. A prime example of this phenomenon would be Hogan's history of claiming to be involved in so-called shoot fights. In 2009, he told Anthony Cumia's arch-enemy Boomer Esiason that during his time in Japan in the 1970s, he faced off with a lot of pride fighters, and didn't know whether he would be getting into the ring with a shooter or not. This was a point that he reiterated in 2023 during an appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience, where he again stated that he wrestled with pride guys in the 70s. There's a pretty big problem here. Pride didn't hold its first event until 1997. If that wasn't enough, Hogan also claimed that he was offered a spot in the first UFC event but turned it down because, quote, "It was very violent and the referees weren't stopping matches and letting guys get beat up when they should have been stopped," end quote. That said, shortly after Hulk made this claim in April of 2015, UFC co-founder Campbell McLaren said it was bullshit and he never asked Hogan to be in the UFC. As far as I know, nobody has come forward to corroborate Hogan's claim. But the rabbit hole goes even deeper. In the 2004 WWE DVD, Hulk Still Rules, Hogan made the bizarre assertion that one of his matches with Tatsumi Fujinami was an out-and-out shoot, implying that Fujinami was trying to beat him for real and take the WWF title. Only there doesn't seem to be any evidence to support this, other than the Hulkster's word. Hogan only wrestled Fujinami a handful of times as far as I can tell, and none of the available footage looks like anything other than a worked wrestling match. It's a case where Hogan can't be 100% proved wrong, but the story simply doesn't add up. I'd argue that this is why so many of Hogan's shoot-fight related stories stem from his days in Japan. With the line between work and shoot sometimes blurring in those days, there is some degree of plausible deniability, and unlike with many of his other lies, he can't be fully proven wrong. This is where we come to the story of Koji Kitao and John Tenta, another famous shoot fight that occurred in Japan in the 90s. In April of 1991, the WWF put on a show with the Japanese wrestling promotion Super World of Sports called Wrestle Dream. One of the matches from this card between Koji Kitao and John Tenta, aka Earthquake, has become quite infamous over the years because of the way it devolved into a legit shoot. Both men were at one time sumo wrestlers. Kitao made the rank of Yokozuna before being forced to retire amid controversies that aren't really germane to this video. Tenta started as an amateur wrestler in his home country of Canada, but later became an NCAA-level wrestler for LSU, as well as playing football and rugby. In his early 20s, he became a sumo wrestler and would amass a 24-match unbeaten streak in 8 months. However, he would ultimately quit sumo due to the physical demands of the sport, and potentially the fact that he would have needed to get a skin graft to remove the large tattoo on his arm. This shared background in sumo has led some people to believe that the match went south because Kitao did not want to lose to a lower-ranked sumo wrestler, but this matter still remains somewhat of a mystery. The match started off pretty normally, but it began to go south around the 3-minute mark when Tenta grabbed a waistlock and Kitao appeared to genuinely hand-fight him and refused to work. Shortly afterward, Tenta manhandled Kitao to the ground and covered him. Kitao escaped by scurrying under the ring ropes, and from this point on, chaos ensued. Kitao threw a table at the ring in frustration while the crowd booed him. He eventually got back in the ring, but the atmosphere had become much more tense. For several minutes, they mostly circled each other, with Tenta attempting to initiate worked wrestling scenarios, and Kitao trying to grapple for real while throwing shoot kicks at John. For much of this match, Kitao had his right hand cocked up with 2 fingers extended, and on multiple occasions he attempted to go for Tenta's eyes. After several more minutes of tense circling and shoot kicks from Kitao, Tenta shouted at him, appearing to say, "Who do you think you are? This is pro wrestling." After this, the footage cut to a package declaring Tenta the winner by disqualification, but footage from the crowd showed Kitao kick the referee. After being disqualified, Kitao left the ring and grabbed a microphone, where he apparently proceeded to bury Tenta and the crowd and call wrestling fake. By this point, you're probably saying, I thought this was supposed to be a video about Hulk Hogan. How does he fit into all of this? In August of last year, Hogan appeared on This Past Weekend with Theo Von and claimed that he was supposed to be Koji Kitao's original opponent.
So this sumo wrestler, it was his first night, the booker told this Japanese guy that he wanted him to put me over. He goes, "No, I'm not letting him win."
However, when they learned that Kitao intended to shoot on Hulk and beat him for real, John Tenta stepped in to take Hogan's place.
Big guy there from Vancouver named John Tenta called Earthquake. And him and I were really good friends. He goes, "No, Terry, you're not going out there. I am." As soon as Tenta went out there, this guy tried to hook his eye right away. And man, it pissed Tenta off. Tenta beat the shit out of him. I was like...
It's a story that seems to fit Tenta's reputation as a badass who could hold his own in a real fight, as well as being an all-around stand-up guy. But it probably didn't happen. I've seen some comments saying that other wrestlers confirmed Hogan's story, but I can't find them. Either way, it just doesn't add up logistically. Hogan did wrestle on the same card against Yoshiaki Yatsu in the main event for the WWF title. Tenta versus Kitao was the 4th to last match on the card, which means that if Hogan's version of events was accurate, he would have initially been facing Kitao in the main event for the WWF heavyweight belt. That seems like something people would have remembered about this already infamous story. Also, it means that they would have had to switch the bout order around, making a new main event sometime the night of the show, but no later than the 4th to last match on the card. Otherwise, Tenta would not have been able to volunteer himself to take Hogan's place against Kitao. But that isn't how Hogan describes it happening. He makes it seem like he was about to walk out to the ring for the match when Tenta stepped in, which just couldn't have happened. Additionally, if there is any promotional material from this card showing Hogan against Yoshiaki Yatsu in the main event, it would totally prove this story to be a lie. Honestly, the whole story is perplexing. Hogan's need to insert himself into this well-known event doesn't make sense. The fact that he waited until after John Tenta was dead to tell it just seems really craven and pathetic, especially because he says Tenta was a good friend of his. Even this isn't the most ridiculous story Hogan has told about being in a shoot fight, though. No, that goes to him saying he once boxed George Foreman for 3 rounds. As Hogan explained in his autobiography, his good friend George Foreman invited him down to Houston for a charity event at his youth center, which Hogan felt the need to point out was hot and not air-conditioned. But to Hulk's surprise, there was a boxing ring in the middle of the youth center, and unbeknownst to him, Foreman had told all of the kids that they were going to box for 3 rounds. Thankfully, Hogan had enough self-awareness not to claim that he was competitive in this boxing match. He basically said that Foreman was toying with him and still punched him in the arm hard enough to make his legs go numb. I don't understand the medical explanation for that, so maybe a doctor can explain it in the comments. What makes this story so preposterous to me is not the idea that Hulk Hogan got inside a boxing ring with George Foreman. It's the fact that there is apparently no evidence. Really think about that for a minute. Hogan and Foreman, sometime in the 90s, both global superstars still close to the peak of their notoriety, engage in a charity boxing match, and there is no evidence of it. Now, you might say that this was an impromptu sparring session for some kids at a youth center, so maybe there weren't any journalists around. Aside from the fact that even if this match happened in the deepest backwater ass crack of Cambodia, there probably would have been a guy with a Polaroid camera there to snap a couple of pictures for the Phnom Penh Post. Hogan says in his book that the fucking TV stations were there. I'm not saying this event 100% didn't happen. Maybe one day somebody will dust off an old VHS tape and it will be a news clip of Hogan and Foreman boxing. Maybe sitting right next to it will be footage of Wilt Chamberlain's 100-point game too, or the alternate angle of the moon landing. As absurd as this story is though, at least there is some infinitesimally small chance it's true. Hogan isn't lying wholesale about a well-known and documented event in history. You can't say the same about many of his other lies. Hogan's biggest and probably most well-known lie is less of a single lie in particular, and more of an ongoing series of retcons regarding his legendary match with Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 3. Over the years, Hogan has given dimensions for Andre that apparently range as high as 7 feet 4 inches tall and 800 pounds. But those numbers and the alleged injuries Hulk sustained during the lift have changed over time. In his 2009 memoir, he said that Andre was nearly 700 pounds and that lifting the Giant for the slam tore the muscles in his back. He seemingly ran with this just under 700 pound story for several years. When speaking to Bubba the Love Sponge, he said that they weighed Andre at a baggage claim at the airport in Detroit and he weighed 697 pounds. He also claimed that lifting Andre up for the slam tore all the muscles in his back as well as his shoulders and both triceps. In 2010, Hogan told a similar story to Michael Schiavello, but in this version, Andre was closer to 690 when they weighed him.
And we went to the airport and he got on the scales and you said over 600 pounds. He was actually closer to 7.
And lifting the Giant tore his back, both biceps, and his delt in 3 places.
And when I turned him, it tore my back, and it tore my bicep, it tore my delt in 3 places, but I turned him over.
2 years later, he would tell Get in the Game TV that he only tore the back muscle under his right armpit and both of his biceps.
I ripped my whole back out under my armpit, ripped both of my biceps. Now both of my biceps are torn if you get a close look at me, but I never had them fixed. That was...
In 2015, he was on the BS Report with Bill Simmons, and he dialed Andre's weight back a bit while maintaining that he was never only 500 pounds.
How tall was he, do you think?
He started out around 7'4". We weighed him at Detroit at the airport before WrestleMania 3. He was like 650 something, So, I mean, it's kind of like...
650?
Hogan would also go on to say that during the match he tore both of his biceps but flew to Japan the next day and wrestled for 8 or 9 days.
Tore my biceps picking him up. Nowadays you'd get cut and put in a sling for 6 months, but I split the next day and went to Japan for like 8 or 9 days.
This seems to be the general story he stuck to, at least recently, as evidenced by his video with Men's Health.
As you can see, I never had my biceps fixed. I tore both of my biceps, and this part of my back is solid, but this part is all torn away.
The truth is, there is simply no indication that Andre was 600 pounds, even at his heaviest, and irrespective of Hulk's story about the magical baggage claim scale, he definitely did not get up to 700 pounds, let alone fucking 800. Hogan's claims about his injuries are still pretty dubious, but a little more plausible. He might have injured himself slamming Andre, but the idea that he injured his back and his shoulders and both biceps is ridiculous. In fact, the claim that he tore every muscle in his back at WrestleMania 3 and then wrestled in Japan for 29 days straight was something that was brought up in his medical malpractice deposition. Hogan was forced to admit that he only tore his lat muscle before going to Japan. Even still, there are problems with that story because there is no way he flew to Japan the day after WrestleMania 3 and wrestled for any amount of time. I guess it's not technically a lie because he did continue to wrestle in Japan several years later. There are elements of Hogan's side of the story that we know to be factually untrue though. Hogan has claimed that this was the first time Andre had been body slammed, but that is simply false. Numerous wrestlers had slammed Andre dating back to the early 70s. This wasn't even the first time Hogan had slammed Andre. He had done so as far back as 1980. And he slammed Andre again at WrestleMania 4, which you'd think would be impossible if doing it the last time took such a heavy toll on the Hulkster's body. This isn't even the most absurd and factually incorrect statement Hogan has made about this match. During a 2005 episode of MTV Cribs, Hulk claimed that Andre died days after he slammed him.
I wrestled Andre the Giant with these boots on, and then a couple days later he passed on. These are my favorite pair of boots.
Andre would live for another 6 years and didn't even stop wrestling until 1992. With some of Hogan's lies, you can understand how he thought he might get away with them. With this one, I can't even begin to fathom it. We're talking about one of the most notable moments in wrestling history that featured 2 of the most famous wrestlers of all time. Even in a pre-internet era, it would be an unthinkable thing to try and lie about. But in 2005, it boggles the mind. Weirdly though, this isn't even the only time Hogan has tried to claim some kind of connection or outright involvement in another wrestler's death. In 1983, Hogan would wrestle Antonio Inoki for the original version of the IWGP title. Towards the end of their match, Hulk would go for the Axe Bomber, which was his finishing move in Japan. Inoki, who was standing on the apron of the ring, was violently knocked off and appeared to have been knocked unconscious. Hogan watched on in confusion as Inoki failed to rise despite numerous attempts to revive him that involved violently shaking his head and slapping him. Probably great for concussion, guys. Eventually, an honestly distraught-looking Hogan was named the winner of the match as Inoki was carried out on a stretcher. From my understanding, this is one of those instances in wrestling where the line between fact and fiction genuinely blurred. Whether Inoki had actually been knocked out by Hogan was uncertain, and based on Hogan's general demeanor as he watched the events unfold, he seemed pretty rattled by the whole situation. But it was a work, just a very, very sneaky work. During an episode of Talk is Jericho from November of 2022, Wrestling Observer's Dave Meltzer and wrestling historian Fumi Saito discussed the famous match between Hogan and Inoki. According to Saito, Antonio Inoki had been incredibly secretive about his interaction to pretend to be knocked out.
Not everybody had the same answer. That's how mysterious Inoki is. But the referee didn't know about it, Sakaguchi didn't know about it, Hulk Hogan didn't know about it, Inoki just decided to lay there, right?
Now, had Hulk Hogan simply run with the story that he thought he had knocked Inoki out and was shitting his pants thinking about the repercussions, I don't think anyone would have a problem with it. It's a more than entertaining story on its own. But this is Hulk Hogan we're talking about, so he had to take it even further. Back in 2008, he appeared on Bubba the Love Sponge's show and made it seem like Inoki had developed an ego after beating Muhammad Ali and started to believe he was a real shooter. If that weren't enough, Hogan then claimed that when he wrestled Inoki tried to shoot on him, so Hogan elbowed him in the temple and knocked him out. If you believe me, it actually gets worse. For the next 5 days, Hogan said he had his passport confiscated and was forced to switch hotels because of death threats. Only when Inoki finally held a press conference with Hulk from the hospital to let everyone know he was okay was Hogan allowed to leave the country. Is it possible that Hogan received death threats after the match? A segment of the population just isn't very bright. Did he get threatened by the Yakuza or have his passport confiscated until he did a press conference with Inoki? That I very much doubt, and my attempts to find a picture of this through Google, even in Japanese, didn't turn anything up. The fact of the matter is, Hulk Hogan did not knock Inoki out so badly that he had to be brought back from the brink of death and spend 5 days in the hospital. It was an incredibly well executed and believable work, but a work nonetheless. Hogan's attempt to spin the incident as Inoki developing a big ego and trying to fight him for real is simply a lie. But it's far from the worst lie of this nature because he's also inserted himself into the real deaths of pro wrestlers. When Hogan appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience in August of 2023, he told many lies, but a few stood out. One was the story of his weird connection to the murder of Bruiser Brody. According to Hogan, he was wrestling in Puerto Rico, and after the event, he and Randy Macho Man Savage went back to Savage's dressing room and found it had been trashed. Hogan then went to his own dressing room where a man with a gun was waiting for him and said that if Hogan ever came back to Puerto Rico, he would kill him. Hogan immediately left Puerto Rico and flew all the way to California, but then claims that 4 months after this incident, Bruiser Brody was called into the bathroom by the booker and had his throat slit. As with many Hogan stories, there is a grain of truth buried in there somewhere. He did wrestle in Puerto Rico, and maybe a guy threatened him with a gun, but there is no proof one way or another, just Hogan's word, which is very questionable. Nevertheless, we know that the show Hogan referenced took place on October 19th, 1985. Brody was stabbed more than 2 years later on July 16th of 1988. Also, his throat was not slit, he was stabbed in the abdomen and died hours later. He was not found dead in the shower. This is still not the end of Hogan's inaccuracies, though. He claimed that Brody was killed after the match because he refused to put the Puerto Rican wrestlers over, but that's just factually untrue. The altercation happened before the event, and the other wrestlers weren't afraid to return to Puerto Rico for the trial as Hogan claimed. Wrestlers like Dutch Mantell and others who actually were there at the time of the murder received their subpoenas after the trial was over.
I've said before, my subpoena for the trial came in the day after they held it. Because I looked at the date on the letter, and it was mailed 10 days before the trial, but the mail was so slow it had just got to me where I was.
Moreover, the trial of Jose Gonzalez, aka Invader One, is viewed by many as being a sham trial due to his suspected political connections and status in Puerto Rico. Is it possible that Hogan was simply misremembering the events of this dark moment in pro wrestling history, and he got virtually everything wrong about it purely by accident? I guess, but then why even tell it in the first place if you're unsure of the details? Saying, "Yeah, brother, a guy pulled a gun on me and a few years later a guy named Bruiser Brody was killed by the Booker," is a scary enough story on its own. No need for embellishment or lying. Honestly, this just feels like Hulk Hogan's equivalent of saying he was supposed to get on one of the planes that was hijacked on 9/11, if he hasn't already made that claim somewhere. But as I've said before, it gets even worse. At least in this story, Hogan said there was a period of several months separating him from another wrestler's death. Not so with his lie about Carrie von Erich. The story of the Von Erich family is a complex and deeply tragic one, but for the sake of brevity, we can't really get into it. Following a motorcycle accident and an amputation of his right foot, as well as drug and legal issues and his marriage falling apart, Carrie von Erich became suicidal. Sadly, on February 18th of 1993, he took his own life on his father's property. Even though I'm leaving a tremendous amount out of the Carrie von Erich story, I'm sure you can tell that it's extremely sad and tragic. All the more so because of its place in the even more sad and tragic story of the Von Erich family that has become a dark part of pro wrestling folklore. It's really not the kind of story that any person with a modicum of self-awareness, tact, or basic human decency would choose to insert themselves into. But this is Hulk Hogan we're talking about. During a 2010 appearance on Bubba the Love Sponge's program, Hogan would make the incredible claim to have been on a flight from Japan with Carrie von Erich only 72 hours before his death. During this conversation, he said they talked about life and Carrie's brothers and his newborn baby. According to Hogan's side of the story, Carrie had no plans to end things at the time. There are numerous issues with this statement. The first is that Hogan's story doesn't match up at all with how Bret Hart described Carrie's mood in the period leading up to his death. Hart spoke about Carrie saying that his brothers were calling him and he wished to join them. Furthermore, this alleged 11-hour conversation during a flight back from Japan almost certainly did not happen. There is no record of either of them having matches in Japan during this time period. To make it even more unlikely, days before his death, Von Erich had been indicted on drug possession charges, stemming from a January 13th arrest, and he was facing the revocation of his 10-year parole for a previous offense. So, the idea that he was flying back and forth between the US and Japan at this particular time seems very hard to believe. Hogan did claim to wrestle 400 days a year due to how often he crossed time zones while flying between the US and Japan, but outside of fucking time travel, this conversation appears to be impossible. Maybe Hogan and Von Erich crossed paths at some point during a flight to or from Japan, but it did not happen 72 hours before Carrie's death. Honestly, it was lies like this one that made me want to make this video. Many of Hogan's lies are inconsequential or genuinely hilarious, like saying on the radio that he had a 10-inch penis and then being forced to explain in court that he in fact did not.
Well, it's not mine, because mine isn't that size, but we were discussing the length of Hulk Hogan's.
Seriously? You
No, seriously, I do not have a 10-inch penis. No, I do not. Okay, seriously.
Fair enough.
But then there are some, like this, that the more you think about them, the darker they get. It's not just that he told an almost certainly false story about an infamous event in wrestling history. Carrie von Erich was a real person whose life ended tragically. He was somebody's son, brother, father, and friend. People were permanently affected by his passing. To insert yourself into that story is so callous and self-absorbed that it's hard to wrap your head around. But it can get even worse. We have to discuss the Hulkster in heaven. For years, Hulk Hogan's musical career has been a subject of mockery among wrestling fans. In large part, this is due to some of Hogan's more absurd claims. Like, he was asked by his good friend Lars Ulrich to join Metallica, and also he tried to join the Rolling Stones. Justin Wang has a great video on the subject where he not only looks into Hogan's claims of almost joining Metallica and the Rolling Stones, but also examines his musical chops in general. I suggest you watch it if you want a more in-depth breakdown of these lies. It's a good video and was one of the things that inspired me to make this video. Suffice to say, Hogan was lying, and his story was contradicted by Lars himself.
Unless he went by, like, his Christian name or something. I don't know if anybody knows what his Christian name was. Dave Smith or something? If there was a whole thing that we had with him under a different name, but I certainly have no recollection of doing anything with Hulk Hogan. Well, damn, that's a very different story from being big pals with Lars Ulrich.
Funnily enough, this is one of the few instances where Hogan was forced to backpedal on a story. Probably because someone similarly famous and influential actually called him out on it. With that in mind, Hogan has been involved in a number of more legitimate musical projects over the years. It's well known that before becoming a wrestler, Hogan was a musician and played bass for a band named Ruckus that was supposedly quite popular in the Tampa Bay area. His most successful musical project was probably 1995's Hulk Rules by Hulk Hogan and the Wrestling Boot Band. Well, that or his collaboration with Green Jelly where they covered Gary Glitter's I'm the Leader of the Gang. That one really aged well, huh, Hulk? Hulk Rules featured Hogan on vocals and bass, as well as his then-wife Linda Bollea, J.J. Maguire, and Mouth of the South Jimmy Hart. As you can imagine, it's not a particularly great album and is generally remembered for the wrong reasons. I mean, Hogan literally facepalmed when it was brought up during an interview with Noisy. Were it not for one specific song, I doubt that Hulk Rules would be so controversial though. I am of course talking about Hulkster in Heaven. Without knowing the broader context, Hulkster in Heaven is an unintentionally funny song about a terminally ill Hulkamaniac, with ridiculous lines like, I read it in the papers, I saw it on TV, I guess there'll be one empty seat when I wrestle at Wembley. I didn't pronounce that incorrectly, Hulk did. Wembley. I used to tear my shirt, but now you've torn my heart. I knew you were a Hulkamaniac, right from the very start. End quote. The chorus is, if anything, even more insipid, with Hulk saying that when he gets to heaven and meets his friend, the two will tag up again. If you didn't know any better, this would seem like a cheesy, if weirdly touching tribute to a fallen Hulkamaniac. But of course, by this point, we do know better. According to Hogan in his 2002 biography, this song was a genuine tribute to a child who really did pass away. I'm going to read you the passage about the story from his autobiography, and I want you to pay attention to the level of compassion and the general tone with which this story is recounted by Hogan. Quote, in 1995, I came out with an album called Hulk Rules by Hulk Hogan and the Wrestling Boot Band. But really, the album was born back in 1992 at Wembley Stadium over in England. Before the show, which was sold out to the walls, I met a Make-A-Wish kid with cancer. He had a doctor and a nurse with him, a whole medical entourage. He was supposed to be sitting ringside when I went out to wrestle, but I didn't see him there. After the match, I came back and said, "Where's the kid?" They told me, oh, he died before the match got underway. Jimmy Hart was with me that night, so he sat down and wrote a song right away in the dressing room. Another Hulkamaniac in heaven. There's one empty seat in Wembley. The little Hulkamaniac that came to see me. It's a ballad, a slow song. Anyway, we sat up and wrote 10 or 11 songs that night, because once we wrote one, we were on a roll. The profits from the record sales went to the family of the kid who died. They were having trouble paying his medical bills, so we helped out. End quote. Did anybody else tear up just a little bit? It was so emotional, and you could tell that this real kid who had a name that Hogan definitely remembers was important to him. Hogan was clearly affected by the child's passing in a way that could only be relieved via an impromptu songwriting session. And just think of what a good guy Hogan is to donate all of the proceeds from the album to this kid's family to pay for his medical bills. Except it's all bullshit. Hogan never wrestled at Wembley Stadium in 1992. This is just a fact. At the time of the event in question, which would have been SummerSlam on August 29th, Hogan was on a hiatus that just coincidentally followed his interview with Arsenio Hall, where he poorly denied allegations that he used steroids. As with the alleged 11-hour flight with Carrie von Erich, it's basically impossible that Hogan was anywhere near Wembley Stadium within the time frame he claims. And there are even more logistical issues with this story. Hogan claims that immediately after the match, he and Jimmy Hart started writing the tribute to the fallen Hulkamaniac. However, this claim was contradicted by J.J. Maguire, who said the song was actually written in 1994. Jimmy Hart corroborated this story as well, saying in the Noisy article that Hulk and everyone else there just chipped in, sat around for a few weeks, and wrote 10 songs. Hogan did wrestle at Wembley in 1994, and maybe a scenario like this played out, but Hulk's claim was that it was written in 1992, so no dice there. As far as the proceeds from the album going to the anonymous kid's family, there is simply no evidence of that happening whatsoever. And it doesn't make sense anyway, as the kid was from the UK and his medical care would have been covered by the NHS. Also, it's just a small complaint, but in the opening lines of Hulkster in Heaven, Hulk says, "I read it in the papers, I saw it on TV." This implies that not only did Hulk know about the child's death before the match, but it was noteworthy enough to make it on the news. You can chalk it up to shitty songwriting, but I'm still considering it a lie. As bad as this is, and it is pretty shameful and disgusting to make up a story about a kid with cancer, it gets even worse. Over the last 22 years, Hogan has embellished this bullshit story in ways that only a delusional narcissist could. When Hulk spoke with Muscle and Health last year to shill some stupid CBD oil product, he told an even more unbelievable version of the Hulkster in Heaven story.
I was in Wembley Stadium and I saw a lot of Make-A-Wish kids. I had a kid there that was in rough shape. The EMTs were with him and he was on a stretcher, and his body odor and stuff, it had a smell to it that I hadn't smelled in a while. Not bad, but it was just a different type of smell. I told the doctors and the EMTs, the kid's in kind of trouble here, so let me say my goodbyes and give him a hug and kiss him. And I got a nice place for him out at ringside at Wembley Stadium. It's all roped off.
In Hulk's original telling of the story, the kid was supposed to be sitting ringside, but in this version, Hulk had a special area roped off for him.
So I went to wrestle and I kept looking and the kid wasn't there. I said, "What happened to the family out there?" And they said, "Oh, the kid passed away." When I found out the kid passed away, my manager, Jimmy Hart, the Mouth of the South, he used to be in a band too. So we stayed up all night and we wrote 12 songs for the kid's family.
Now Hulk is saying that he and Jimmy Hart stayed up all night with the intention of writing 12 songs for the family, not that they just came naturally as part of the writing process after they wrote Hulkster in Heaven. As bad as this is, somehow, Hulk added a whole new set of lies to the story in the form of a strange connection with Simon Cowell. Quote, "Jimmy knew somebody from Select Records, and they got a hold of Simon Cowell. He produced a little album for us, and it went #1 on Billboard for 8 weeks. We donated the money to the family. Then Simon came back to me and said we needed to do the song with a band called Green Jelly and something called I'm the Leader of the Gang, a Gary Glitter song. That did really well on Billboard too. When I returned to the States, I had a crazy idea. Since I was still wrestling, I might make music here too. So I grabbed Cyndi Lauper and Rick Derringer and a bunch of people, and we recut a ton of songs. Simon came over and helped produce the wrestling album. Then he came back and produced the second wrestling album, Pile Driver, and he never left. He stayed here and he became this monster producer. He's the nicest guy in the world. He plays a tough guy on TV, but he's a real sweetheart. We're still great friends to this day." End quote. There is so much wrong with what he said here that it's going to take a minute to untangle all of it. First, Simon Cowell did not produce Hulk Rules. He's not credited on the album, and Jimmy Hart directly contradicted Hulk's story in the aforementioned Noisy interview by saying that Simon Cowell called them up after hearing Hulk Rules and helped facilitate the collaboration with Green Jelly. That also could not have happened as stated because their cover of I'm the Leader of the Gang came out in 1993, 2 years before Hulk Rules. Maybe Simon Cowell did hook them up with Green Jelly, but it can't have happened in the way they're saying it did. And as far as I know, Simon Cowell has not spoken on the issue. Hogan's story about grabbing Cyndi Lauper and Rick Derringer and having Simon Cowell produce the wrestling album and Pile Driver is equally nonsensical. Simon Cowell did work with the WWF to produce WrestleMania, the album, but that came out in 1993. The wrestling album, which did feature Cyndi Lauper and was produced by Rick Derringer, came out in 1985. And Pile Driver, the wrestling album too, came out in 1987. So, unless Hulk Hogan once again used his Time Wizard powers, there is simply no way that Simon Cowell produced Hulk Rules in 1995, then introduced Hogan to Green Jelly in 1993, before coming to the States to work on the 2 wrestling albums in 1985 and 1987 respectively, then circled back to 1993 to do the WrestleMania album. But perhaps Hogan is just that generous with his time manipulation abilities.
Time Wizard!
Also, while it's basically peanuts in comparison to the rest of the lies in this story, Hulk Rules was not #1 on the Billboard charts for 8 weeks. It may have reached as high as #12 on the children's charts depending on who you ask, but it seems hard to verify. Then we have the body odor comments. Hogan stops just shy of saying he could smell death on the kid, but what other implication could there be to this new addition? And what is the point of adding it to this story? To let us know that Hogan is clairvoyant or that he has super senses? This make-believe story is supposed to be about the tragic death of a child, not Hogan being a fucking X-Man. It elevates this from being an incredibly narcissistic and pathetic story to a truly sickening and depraved one. The worst part about all of this is that I don't think it's that far from the truth. Hogan has worked with Make-A-Wish.
It was me, Michael Jackson, Mr. T, who saw all the Make-A-Wish kids during the 80s and 90s.
So this creepy, self-aggrandizing, child-sniffing fable was very likely inspired by real experiences Hogan had. But rather than actually dedicating the song to a real child or children or working with Make-A-Wish to produce Hulk Rules for charity, he just made a story up afterwards to make himself look like a thoughtful and charitable guy instead of a self-obsessed ghoul. It's fucking disgusting. At the same time, the story of Hulkster in Heaven is the most quintessential Hulk Hogan lie, because it's lies within lies, and to get to the truth you have to peel back the various layers and sift through all the detritus to find the evidence that proves him wrong. That can take hours, which is how, despite being called out countless times over the years, Hogan is still able to get away with most of this bullshit. When he was shilling CBD oil last year, he went on numerous podcasts and spoke for hours. I'm sure he told many more tall tales that the vast majority of people would not be able to debunk without investing a considerable amount of time into it. And if you're not familiar with Hogan's reputation as a liar, why would you even bother? It does make you wonder why he does it though. Hulk is a living legend. He's one of the greatest pro wrestlers of all time and one of the most recognizable pop cultural figures of the 20th century. He's accomplished more than most people could ever dream of, and he's had enough experiences to fill multiple lifetimes. Why does he feel the need to embellish stories that were already legendary by any standard? Why do they get more grandiose as time goes by? Why does he make up stories out of whole cloth? That question is the reason I wanted to make this video in the first place. Hulk's lies are frequently hilarious, either because they're so ridiculous that they defy logic, or because they're so clearly lies that you wonder why he even tried telling them in the first place. But some of them are also quite dark and disturbing for what they suggest about his character. There is something insidious about his need to insert himself into stories of other wrestlers or insinuate he has some connection to the dead. I get the feeling that Hogan is unhappy with the idea that there could be any notable event in wrestling history that doesn't bear the mark of the Hulkster. So now he's retconning himself into events he never took part in, and in many cases would have been physically impossible for him to take part in. I suppose some of it comes down to Hogan honestly misremembering things. As I said, he has enough memories for multiple people, so it's possible he just gets things mixed up sometimes. I'm sure I got some things wrong while making this video, and I spent a lot of time researching it. I'm not going off the top of my head in a live interview. Also, Hogan has suffered a bunch of head injuries, so I doubt his memory is 100% as good as it could be. It's understandable that he might get some facts wrong, or misremember the date something happened. Regardless, some of these lies are so egregious that they can't be justified as simple mistakes. The only explanation is deception. The question then becomes, is he doing it intentionally? You start to wonder if he knows what he's saying is bullshit, or if he's told himself the story so many times that he actually believes it to be true. Is he saying these things as Hulk Hogan the character, while Terry Bollea the man knows them to be false? Are they even separate entities anymore? Or has the line between them blurred to the point that the distinction can no longer be drawn? Ultimately, that's a question that only Bollea/Hogan has the answers to.
We've talked about Hulk Hogan several times. I need to make you understand this, that Hulk Hogan gave up his privacy the moment he walked out his front door, became a celebrity in anonymity. And so I don't like talking about Hulk Hogan's penis, but I've already tried to explain to you, I gave up my right as Hulk Hogan to have Hulk Hogan have any privacy. I don't know how much clearer I can make that to you.
As always, I want to thank you for watching the video, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing. If you would like to support the channel, please consider becoming a channel member. leaving a super thanks, or visiting the Patreon. And a special thank you to my supporters on Patreon who help make these videos possible. Thank you. Squirt, Jonas Namenson, Rusty Shackelford, Jackson, Fightback CBD, Mike Roballs, Bone CK, Gaius Anicha Patton, Scott Richmond, Random Candor, Fuzi Eunice, Dot Old Neon, Timothy Lee Peterson, Julius Caesar Has Jungle Fever, Firebrand, Quasi, Sneps, Alex, Dimmy Stinkpong, and Neem.